Hey guys, I don't know how long I'll be able to make this video. Obviously I don't have a plan for it because I never do, except in that I want to talk about Taoist esoteric practice and Toltecism. First with the Toltecs. You're welcome. First with the Toltecs. History says that the Toltecs were a people. Almost like a race, you know, almost like a South to Mesoamerican, I think. Yeah. People. Like a culture. And Coyote says that that's not true. They did make places, but these were not cities and societies that were Toltec societies, and we are under Toltec rule, and I am a Toltec person, and so is my child. You know, that's not what it was. The Toltecs were a group of people who were, I guess I would call them spiritualists. You could call them priests, but I would not put religion into it. You could call them shamans, but I would not put them into the role of the shaman traditional, or the shaman proper, because the shaman proper, first of all, that all comes from Siberia, and to see that role of the shaman, it's a very specific thing. Of course, we've come to use the word shaman, and it applies to all these things, so it just means like what we used to call medicine man in English from the Native American traditions, right? And yet it still has the meaning to me of one person who has a calling and follows that calling, probably ends up living on the fringes of her tribe, or maybe off in the forest where nobody else wants to live for reasons. Often those were the gay people, the trans people, the people who just had things different. Sometimes physical deformities were a sign, oh, you need to go through the trials and the initiations and become a shaman. And that is a sort of different role than what I think the Toltecs had. I think that the Toltecs, in some ways, to me, when I intuitively think about them, I think of theater! Only because what they were doing was the theater of life. They were like players, and they were creating a space in order for people to wake up. That's what they did. And from this deep reality bending that they were doing came Nagualism. Nagualism is basically what Coyote does. I'm always talking about Coyote. I can call him one of my teachers, although he doesn't call himself a teacher. And you can start to see the veins between us and how they make sense, and how it's always been that way. I don't know why it only took me until this year to realize that he and I actually have a lot of things in common, and I'm actually thinking about asking him, you know, for formal training, or that I could, you know, hey, teach, what I need to do next, kind of a thing. Because I've never picked a teacher, you know? I've never picked a master, because I always felt I could do it by myself. And since Coyote doesn't consider himself a teacher, then almost it's like, why bother? I don't know. I am going to ask him. But, yeah, so that's what Coyote deals with. And the other thing that is everything from Carlos Castaneda. Carlos Castaneda describes Toltec Nahualism, Nahualismo. And I suppose Don Juan de Matus, I think it was a Nahual. I mean, he was a Toltec, you know? Obviously, late day Toltec. The thing about the Toltecs is that they did not preserve anything except by that's not the right word, percolating down through different cultures naturally, as in organically. They did not go, ha, we're taking this school and moving to these mestizo Indian peoples and we're going to teach them the real way of the Nagual and this is reality, not your stupid little consensus reality and your dumb little rituals to the sun and the, and all this stuff. That's not what they did. They were like, okay, our time's over. We've got this amazing energy and we're just going to let it spread. And so they went here, they went there, and they never made any... They made tons of inroads into every single other culture that exists in America, the Americas. And so you will find the ideas of the Toltecs in some peoples. Don Juan considered himself a Yaqui Indian, and yet if you look at all of the stuff that he teaches, it has nothing to do with Yaqui culture. It has nothing to do with Yaqui traditions. There are no Yaqui ceremonies in it. He loves the Yaqui Indians and he thinks that they're awesome and that Mexicans are stupid. He literally says that in one of his books. There's a lot of weird stuff in there. But he means spiritually stupid because they can't see the reality. Their blood has been too mixed with all these Europeans who are blind idiots. It's really interesting stuff to read. But you will find that nothing that he has to do has anything to do with anything any Yaqui has ever done. He is a Toltec. Okay? So that's what the Toltecs did. They went and they sort of infiltrated these different cultures, but it wasn't like the Spanish coming into the New World and saying, you must all convert to Toltecism now, or whatever, that wasn't it. They just let themselves blend into everything else. And when you have that much power and that much truth, as in you're just holding the space that is true to you and what your people were, you have that, it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, it goes places, but it doesn't disappear, it doesn't die. And they were able to preserve their teachings and their way of life in sort of by letting them die, by letting it just percolate out into different societies. So you have, so I was trying to describe it, and I'm trying to do a blog about this. You would have these little gobbets of Toltec wisdom, just boop, 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 boop. They pop up all over the place, like you weren't even, what? Where did that come from? And you start to see within other cultures these little bubbles that start to burst things around them. That's what the Toltecs were for. They were like anti-culture. They weren't, a culture or a race of people or a nation or something like that. So I consider them to be theater of life reality benders is what I consider them to be. So they built these things, these places like Teotihuacan, and I think that's supposed to be a Toltec site. Is it Teotihuacan? That seems, yeah. That's the one that means the place where men become gods, right? Yeah. And so you would be in this amazing pyramidal structure, which was, bursting with energy, that all of these people were probably in different sections of it, just wafting that stuff out or holding this space, just being in the Nagual or whatever they were doing, I don't know, to make so that you walk into this road and you go to these different steps and different columns and things and you have this experience. It's like you go now and stand in front of these magnificent structures and you have an experience. Imagine what it was like when all of the priest shamans were there and they were doing their things and there were ceremonies and weird people with masks freaking you out, man. Like all that kind of stuff. Like it would have been an incredible space for people to wake up. And it would have been very specific, I think. So they created these cities and that's what the Toltecs were known for. And apparently Toltec means... It's the same tech, supposedly, with the root word that we take, tech, when I think is from Greek. That means technology or building stuff. So the Toltecs were builders as well. And that's how they were remembered amongst most people, because they were the builders of the pyramidal structures. I don't think the Egyptian ones, but especially in Mesoamerica and stuff. So... That's what they were doing. At the same time, I believe that the progenitor culture rather not culture, but group or groups of people who had these same ideas originally probably came from different little pockets of Atlanteans and maybe some Lemurians who were left over way back. I'm talking, and those pockets of people were able to do their own thing and influence and go different places and influence different cultures in certain ways. Some did it directly. We're like, here, build this, do that. This is the way agriculture works, etc. Now I'm talking about that alternative view of history where there was originally cultures all over the world and everything was there, and we might call that Atlantis or something. And then something happened and all of that was wiped away. And then the survivors went to the tribal peoples of the world to tell them, no, this is how you need to step up your game. We like to think that culture just progresses naturally. And yet we have cultures on this earth right now that have no idea that airplanes exist, or that there's an internet, or that there are even other people in the world. There are Amazon tribes like that. There are tribes this is one tribe off the island of on an island off the coast of India, far away from it actually, where they are so hostile they will kill anyone who even comes near the shore. They will throw spears at you. Like, this is like old movie type stuff that we're like, what? That still exists in the world today? Yeah, it does. And these people are not going, yes, we must improve our culture, we must build pyramids to the gods. That never happened. These things had specific purposes. People only can think about what they need to survive right now, and that's why humans stay in this homogeneous culture, whatever the culture may be, that tribal way of life and that survivalism. We don't progress beyond that unless somebody comes in and says, do something else, why not? Culture is for bacteria, okay? Boop, in a little dish. Specialization is for insects, not humans. This is not the best of us. People, when they talk about this archaic revival nonsense and they really want to go back to this old pastoral way of living, I'm saying, okay, you want to devolve? I don't believe, don't get me wrong, okay, because that could sound really bad, what I just said. I do not believe that our Western culture is the pinnacle of civilization and that we need to go and all of that. No, I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm talking about. But the knowledge and the understanding, the wisdom about the world and connection and communication and all of that happens and has happened for a reason. And I think eventually we'll start to get it right. And eventually, there won't be any of those cultures left on this earth, But again, who's going to survive if another global cataclysm comes along? It ain't going to be us. We'll all be like naked, with like looking for things in old houses and like scrounging around, trying to, huddle in cardboard boxes or whatever, and they'll all just be going on completely fine with their lives, Okay, now I've lost my point. So, I do believe that there was several progenitor cultures. We like to say Lemurian civilization, Atlantean civilization. We forget that if we're going to believe in either of these, both of them basically come from channelers, except for Plato's version of Atlantis. And so we need to accept the fact that this stuff is probably the way that everything happened probably the way these channelers and clairvoyants have outlined it, as in Blavatsky, Steiner, Casey to some extent, Gurdjieff to some extent, and this one other, I think, American channeler, psychic, clairvoyant who talked about the progenitor races or humans or beings that have existed on this planet in the past and whatnot. So basically, we forget that the Lemurians were supposed to have 5 subraces or 4 subraces, I think. I think they were the 4th iteration of beings on this planet. Maybe the 3rd. No, let's say that they were the 3rd. And so there will be 3 subraces of Lemurians. Right? So it's supposed to be holographic. So the first beings on this planet, sort of, were the Polarians, and they were, you know, giant etheric monster creatures like you would see in Miyazaki. They're just like, you know, and were made of like aurora or something, you know, very non-corporeal, very, you know, out there, etheric, whatever you want to call it, completely in bliss and harmony all the time. And then we moved to another one, and those were the Hyperboreans, and they like to live on the poles and blah, 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 or something like that. I don't know. I'm getting it confused up, but I don't want to go into too much detail. You're supposed to have these progenitor being races. I don't like the word races, but this is not just to talk about that. So I'm just going to use it. So you had these progenitor races, and then you had, so each one would have a number of sub-races based off of the number that it was, as in the ordinal of that race. So the third race on this earth is going to have 3 sub-races. The fourth is going to have 4 sub-races. The fifth is going to have 5, and so on. It's supposed to be this holographic thing. Blavatsky talks about that a lot. So just from knowing that, or just from looking around you right now, it is very easy to see that there's no such thing as one human culture, right? We have myriads of human cultures and different ways of looking at things. So it is, why would it have been different in the past? Maybe you can come up with a reason, you know, evolution and the way the brain was developing and consciousness and all of this stuff. Maybe it was a little more homogenized or whatever, but I really don't think that we're able to just point to one Lemurian culture or one Lemurian race or one Atlantean culture, you know? I mean, even these psychics and stuff, they talk about the Atlantean race in the fall, that they had, as there were all of these different factions of Atlanteans who were like, no, we're working for good and we're only doing the good stuff. And then there were these like evil Atlanteans who were just, you know, just obsessed with the fact that they were worshiping themselves. They, at the Atlanteans, were only up to the point of consciousness where they realized that their self was God. But they forgot that there was the greater God beyond them, like Brahma. You know, they forgot that Atman is Brahma eventually. They just got to the Atman stage, and then they reversed it back and were like, yeah, I'm totally worshiping myself. So they became their own gods, which is necessary for our consciousness evolution. So I don't want you to think that they were just all bad people, because it's not the case. You know, it would be like saying all humans are terrible, vicious, genocidal monsters. We are not all that way, even though we've acted that way a lot in the past and still are. So there would have been a bunch of offshoots and different groups and different sects and ways of thinking and all of this stuff. Magical orders out there that were trying to do certain things, probably for their own preservation, some for other reasons, some for the actual benefit of us and the people who would come after them should we survive. So you have all these different little subs. And I think that it was a subrace of Lemurians that lasted through the Atlantean epic and was able to influence different cultures at different times because they decided that that was like their last thing to give. Because according to all the psychic researchers, the Lemurians reached a point in their evolution where they were no longer doing anything to benefit the next race of humans or the next race of beings that would exist on this planet, right? And they reached a certain point in their evolution, and then they were just existing, you know, and they're like, oh, we're not doing anything else good, so we're just going to let ourselves gradually fade out of existence. And they did. One of the other things to realize about this is even though they were completely different physical beings from us, they didn't have gender at first, they were evolving over thousands and thousands and thousands of years to be more gendered, and the genders first split with the Lemurians, apparently. And that happened so that the separation of the hemispheres of the brain could happen. I know this all sounds pretty wacky. I'm not making it up. It comes from other people, you know. Maybe they made it up. So that the hemispheres of the brain, what I would call the different lines of energy that run through the body, as in the internal ones with Kundalini Yoga, like Ida and Pingala, I would just go yin and yang currents. And those yin and yang currents had to really, I think they were always there, but they were like this. That was the Lemurians. Like they were just, you know, they had this energy moving around them, and so they were so just in themselves. They weren't split apart like us. And then as things started moving faster and faster and faster, we get this, and we get to this level of consciousness where we're like, oh my gosh, like this is, everything is polarized for us, you know? And I think it has to do with the natural progression of consciousness. Anyway, yeah, I completely lost my point now. I'm just talking about the different sub-races. So, I think that the Toltecs were that, and I think that they were originally Lemurians. But that's what I'm trying to say. You have to understand that as these evolutions happen, it becomes impossible for these different beings to exist on this planet. So as they're sort of fading out and other beings are coming into existence, as in the Lemurian epoch is over and so the Atlantean one is beginning, that does not mean that suddenly, you know, the last Lemurian died and then poof, all of a sudden the Atlanteans are there and they start to come up. That's not how it works. This is thousands of years of Lemurians slowly giving rise to the new race of beings called the Atlanteans. They were the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans that they came from a subrace of Lemurians. So a subrace means they are evolving slowly into something else, right? So those would have been, to me, I think, and this is where it gets confused. Well, it's always been confusing. This is where, to me, the confusion arises between terms when we're talking about the Toltecs. Because Coyote does not agree with this, I don't believe, or he might not say either one, or might not have an opinion either way, but he expounds upon the fact that the Toltecs were not a race of people. Okay, to him they were humans, you know, and they had this specific way, and they just started this culture in South America and Middle America, and that's that. To me, I like to go back further, and I think that they were actually a subrace of Lemurians, and if you look at the psychic research in between, you will find that some researchers actually call the subrace of Lemurians that gave rise to the Atlanteans the Toltecs. I don't know why they chose that. I think that there must be some connection, and they just picked that name. I don't think that Coyote likes to use that, because to him they were humans, and that's all fine, and that was that. Okay, so just making that connection there. I've been wanting to say that one for a long time. Now, the woo. I think that well, first of all, the Chinese, who became mostly the, let's see, so much stuff. Okay, so the Chinese progenitor race was considered, again, like most of these progenitor races in all of the major cultures around the world, was considered to be semi-divine, or at least magical. Just like the Tuatha De Danann, just like the beings that came to the Americans, the South Americans, you know, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, all these different beings that were like different, or they were light-skinned or whatever, and they came and they had long hair, or they had beards on their faces, which is not normal for the Indians of those places. They were all magical or semi-divine beings in their own collective history, oral history, or sometimes even written. So that was the Wu too, as in the progenitors of the Chinese culture. They were considered to be basically, they're the template for what later became the Taoist immortals. They're talking about riding on clouds, flying, being able to control the weather, you know, having powers of divination and prediction and blah, 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 all this stuff. And they were the ones who taught the Chinese what would, in my mind at least, become all of the Taoist esoteric practices. Not all of them, okay? A lot of it has to do with original Chinese shamanism, and all of that got smashed in together in a very, very successful manner. This is one of the reasons that I really like Chinese culture and Taoist culture in general, is because it never said, oh, we can't do that now, we're just gonna get rid of that, and you can never pay attention to that thing again. They were just like, no, let's take all these things and just combine them together. Oh, the folk, the people are doing this. Then okay, we'll say that it's an ordained practice as well. You know, it was totally cool. Not to say that there wasn't Chinese oppression. Obviously, there has been. There were some rulers that didn't like Taoism, I think, but mostly it was considered the folk religion anyway. The philosophical piece of Taoism came from Lao Tzu, right? So he was the sage that originally started Taoism, as basically he put down these ideas into a workable philosophy and or cosmology. But the practices were already there. The esoteric practices, and possibly even a lot of the shamanism. A lot of people will call the woo shamans. And again, you've heard me talk about that term, and I don't think that's necessarily correct. But I think that they were also doing a lot of that stuff. I think that they were chanting in light language like crazy. If you look at mediumship in Taoist culture, mad light language. They will just sit there and chant something that is obviously, you know, like crazy until they get totally possessed by the deity that they're working with, and then they can do some kind of divination magic or power or healing or exorcism or whatever. It's totally it. You know, that's the stuff. I love that. And so all I'm basically trying to say is all of these things, you can watch like Graham Hancock's videos. Everybody understands, I think, who's into the fringes and alternative views of history, that there was a progenitor race and or culture that existed, probably several, you know, and that went into different places to teach and to, you know, raise the consciousness level of humanity in general so that we would have a chance or something. Maybe it was out of self-preservation. I can't say every single, you know, group of beings' motivations. We don't know. But I think that they were related. I think that, you know, it could have been the same sort of groups of people. You guys go to China and we're going to go down here to India, you know, or whatever. You know, it's so fascinating to me, all these things. And yeah, okay, it's all speculation and possibilities, but when you start to practice the practices and you see that these things actually are related, you really begin to wonder, you know, because you talk about the reality bending Toltecs, and you talk about the magical woo, you know, flying on air and doing all of these things, and you start to practice the practices in between, and you start to realize that they're not so different, and you start to realize that they probably actually have historical connections as well, you know? So even if it wasn't the woo, as in it probably took, you know, a couple hundred years for this group to establish themselves, and they became the woo. It probably took several hundred years for this group to establish themselves down in South America, and they became the Toltecs, you know what I mean? But there are still the connections there. Mostly what matters is the esoteric practice, though. And are you paying attention to energy and working with your own energy and cultivating it in that fashion? I always go to the Taoist stuff or the esoteric Taoist stuff because it seems the most practical. And there are no associations with it. That's one of the other things that really gets me is if you go into the esoteric Taoist practice, there's a lot of colorful language, but there are no deities. There are no, you know, they talk about bright spirits and you meet these and the ancestors and stuff like that, and different planes and different bodies and sheaths and different, you know, methods of astral travel and dream work and all that kind of stuff. It's all there. It's all there, and it's all there in the Toltec stuff too. But there are no religious associations. There are no injunctions, as in you must do this or you're doomed. There's no moralistic bullcrap in it. You know, I could spend another, you know, hour basically talking about